Hello, everyone. My name is Lorna Goldberg, and I'm the director of youth psychoanalytic studies in Jersey. I'm a longtime member of ICSA. And today I'm going to be talking about intergenerational transmission of cult trauma, the impact of cult-created dissociation and occult-created harsh conscience about rearing. This presentation explores the child rearing experiences of a second-generation cult mother, whom I will name Annika, and her third-generation son, David. Their story in the 1970s, 2024. Reflecting three generations, Annika's parents, Annika, and David. I will describe how Annika and David came to understand the cult dynamics that influenced and interfered with their relationship and hindered their ability to empathize with one another. Monica and her mother happened to be members of a support like Bill and me. Monica had contacted me to request a family session after being stressed upon hearing that her son David viewed her as cold. She wished to gain a better understanding of her son's perspective. They were all out of the cult by this time. During the family session, it became clear to me that Annika had been dissociated me rather than a cold. For the first time, Annika was able to explore with her son some of the factors that involved separate association and the incorporation of that belief system. And David was able to discuss how his mother's child this process provided each with some degree of empathy and one another. I had seen how a parent's dissociation had harmed the relationships of many other After the family session, I consulted Annika and David to see whether they'd be interested in describing how their experience was an example of how cults can undermine child rearing experience, and they both agreed. So we began to work on this paper together, and I wanted to discover if my premise was true, that individuals born and raised in cults often endure trauma due to cult dynamics and practices that drive many cult parents into a dissociative state. 2, due to these dynamics and techniques, many parents have become pliable to their leaders' self-serving demands instead of following their pre-cult inclinations if they had a former life. Dissociation hinders many parents' abilities to self-reflect and establish a somatically attuned empathic connection with their children. These dynamics and practices leave their children vulnerable to emotional and physical neglect and abuse. Dissociation refers to the separation of mental and experiential contents, formally be connected. Dissociation is the isolation of elements of experience from each other that decreases coherence, increases a sense of fragmentation, and precludes the possibility of making accurate sense out of perception, self, and world. If you contacted me after this presentation, I'll be glad to share the PowerPoint with you so you don't have to. The vulnerable self will be more likely to adopt dissociation as a coping mechanism because it does not have either the belief in worthiness gained from a loving and responsive early relationship or the normal levels of defense and integration that such a belief affords. Annika entered into a dissociative state as a result of cult trauma from parental loss and sexual abuse, and cult practice of long periods of chanting and meditation. It was the 70s, and many were drawn to the Indian gurus and their Eastern meditation groups that were proliferating in the U.S. Annika's mother, an artist, was searching for the meaning of life. She explored various Eastern meditation groups, ultimately joining the group of an Indian guru. Annika experienced that working for and spending time in the cult facility became her mother's priority, and taking care of the children became secondary. Annika's mother's focus on her work in the cult meant that she was emotionally unavailable to Annika and her younger brother. Annika's mother came to believe that by giving her time and energy to the cult, Annika would be taken care of by the leader's grace, and thereby Annika would be blessed. Over time, Annika's mother thus became more concerned with her spiritual journey and position in the cult than with caring for her family. Annika's father was initially a warm and caring presence. However, according to Annika, as he aged in the cult, he became emotionally distant, hiding behind a wall of jokes and sarcasm. Annika's parents remained devoted for the rest of their lives. They started to integrate into the cult environment. They obtained an apartment next to the cult facility. Summers traveling and living in it or upstate with the cult leader. Annika's mother began traveling to India for long periods of time. They began hosting weekly cult meetings in their apartment. Both Annika and her brother had cult members sleeping in their bedrooms with them. There was neglect. After her mother's affiliation, 7-year-old Annika felt abandoned and anxious when her mother traveled to India for several months each time. Annika now recognizes how she protected herself from grief and anxiety by dissociating. As a result of the cult indoctrination, Annika's mother viewed anything that went well as the leader's grace. She primarily focused on pleasing the cult leader. She believed that everything that happened was meant to be, and this led her to abdicate personal responsibility, reinforcing her dissociation, denial, and alienation from Annika. Annika's fear became a repeated fear of abandonment by others throughout her life. Annika was a teenager in India, far from home and her family, when the cult leader sexually abused her. Reflecting decades after the assault, Annika realized she had dissociated from her fearful emotions and instead justified the abuse, believing the cult message that he could do no wrong, that This left her with feelings of discomfort and confusion about what had happened to her. Some of the victims of the alleged sexual abuse reported that he told them they were receiving a special touch or a special initiation, which was top secret. Although many girls, women, and other members were reportedly aware of the abuse, as the leader was viewed as infallible, members who knew it excused it as a special tantric practice that benefited the victim. The cult story was adolescent girls were needed to provide him with energy, particularly after he suffered from a heart attack. The victim was doing a service, serving a greater good, which was their privilege. Each victim treated this as a secret information that was never to be disclosed. The cult leader was a sannyasi, a sworn celibate monk. However, he allegedly raped or sexually assaulted numerous girls and women. Therefore, cult members were manipulated to believe that physical touch from the leader was a blessing because it transmitted spiritual energy. They thought the leader could awaken the Kundalini in a disciple through his thought, look, word, or touch. Disciples hungered for attention from the leader. Therefore, Annika incorporated the cult message that the leader was perfect, as all those around her told her he was, and therefore his sexual abuse was reframed positively. Trying to nullify and justify her inner distress over the abuse created dissonance in Annika and triggered the survival mechanism of increased dissociation. In contrast to his sexual behavior, the leader undermined intimacy between all the members. Sex was considered a distraction from the goal of enlightenment. Having sex moved the Kundalini spirit down and out rather than internalizing it to fuel an upward rise, bringing the disciple to a higher plane of consciousness. Married couples were permitted to live together, but it was stipulated that they should have sex no more than once a month. The less often, the better, thus undermining intimacy. The cult interfered with the possibility of Annika's mother forming a secure, protective relationship with her daughter. Annika's mother knew that the girls were being abused. Her mother rationalized and found a way to justify the leader's hypocrisy. The leader could do no wrong. Thus, she allowed her 15-year-old daughter to spend months in India, where the cult leader sexually abused her. According to Siskin, analyzing child-rearing practices in several other cults, it was the parents' willingness to subsume their children's interests to the greater good that led them to follow the directives of their leadership, even when these directives ran counter to the natural perceptions and beliefs regarding their children's well-being. Annika secretly wondered why it was okay for the leader to define sex as a distraction, not to be indulgent, yet to indulge himself. This caused profound confusion and cognitive dissonance in her. She displaced these feelings onto others to defend herself by becoming hypersensitive to anyone who said one thing and did another. Annika became deeply ambivalent about her sexuality. Having been taught that sex was negative, Annika later struggled in her marriage with her sexuality. She transmitted that ambivalence to her children, who came to wonder what constituted a healthy sexual relationship. Definition of alignment: a state in which the individual becomes one with God by destroying the self-limiting ego, bad karma, and any sense of separation from God. Cult control. So members were urged to surrender all aspects of individuality to the cult leader: assets, children, relationships, sexuality, career, etc. Any emotion deemed to be negative was frowned upon, its existence condemned, and members blamed for not fully surrendering to the cult leader, are not doing enough chanting, meditation, and selfless service. The members were viewed as the source of any problem. A critical thought or emotion indicated that members were not doing enough on their path to enlightenment. Annika and her parents dedicated their lives to attaining enlightenment through ongoing practices. Paying for and receiving initiation, chanting, meditating, selfless service, workshops, visiting India, reading the leader's books, and offering money or other valuable gifts to their leader. Annika believed she needed to constantly nurture her awakened Kundalini. Long hours of chanting and meditation were necessary to reach this goal. Here were some of the cult control practices to induce dissociation members: chanting in the Sanskrit, sitting on the floor for prolonged chanting and meditation, forcing dissociation from physical discomfort, performing many hours each day of seva or selfless service, conducting chants and workshop ceremonies to various Hindu gods and goddesses, worshipping photos and pujas of the leader, sharing positive experiences in public meetings, conforming to the tradition of silence fostered in the community. The leader monitored members' activities and attendance during the prescribed daily schedule through closed-circuit cameras mounted throughout the facility. Members needed to act or appear in a cult-approved manner at all times, so anxiety was ubiquitous. Seeking enlightenment through these practices reinforced Annika's dissociative state, which became her usual demeanor. Annika also dissociated from overwhelming emotions when the cult's impossible demands became too painful to endure. At the center of the cult was a core group of highly committed members. If anyone in this group was not productive, they were castigated. They had little free time to play, explore, contemplate, or recruit. Annika and the other core members were often in a state of physical and emotional exhaustion or sleep deprivation. Control, the incorporation of the cult's strict and harsh moral voice. The leader controlled every aspect of the members' lives, enforced through his teaching and demands. Members were good and bad according to their adherence to the leader's rules. There was no room for ambivalence, complex failings, or personal diversions. Members experienced shame when they failed to live up to this ideal. To attain enlightenment, Annika believed that she needed to incorporate the leader's harsh moral code enforced on everyone except for the two highly punitive leaders. Cult control. Here are some of his strict demands. Members developed a hyperactive, strict, and black and white conscience fueled by judgmental thinking. Members focused on avoiding trouble and creating bad karma to avoid judgment from others. This kept them centered on attaining the impossible goal of enlightenment, shifting their focus outward away from self-awareness, critical thinking, and self-acceptance. Harsh moral code. Members must be perfect, special, and unimpeachable. Members try to display perfect behavior to avoid badness or shame from failure. Pressure for a perfect image created a desperately anxious nervous system within the cult movement that interfered with soothing in children. Pressure to conform also foster a harsh internalized conscience, severely judgmental of themselves and others, including children, when they failed to perform on the highest level. The cult's black and white thinking was delivered in a judgmental manner, and parents felt pressure to teach their children to conform to cult rules. This cult attitude led parents and children to harsh self-judgment and to internalize judgmental thinking towards others, showing the influence of identification with the oppressed. Both dynamics induced adult members to regress to becoming like children in their relationship with the abusive leader. Ferenczi's concept of identification with the aggressor was first used to explain how children respond to their abuser. They give up their sense of self and completely submit. In doing so, to protect themselves, they become hypervigilant to the feelings of the abuser, lose touch with their own emotions, and take the blame for being abused. Therefore, members anxiously self-monitor to adhere to the strict rules, suppressed emotions, and maintain the prescribed modes of appearance. Members were outer-directed. They learned to disconnect from their inner voice, impulses, desires, and morals. There could be no expression of anger or grief. Like her mother, Annika gave up agency and surrendered to cult control processes throughout her childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. She was told what to eat, drink, wear, do, like, dislike, whom to relate to, and whom to shun. When cult members inevitably failed to achieve the ideal, they defended themselves from intense feelings of shame by attempting at least to look superior on the outside to others. This outer superior demeanor was their desperate attempt to remain higher in the cult's strict hierarchy and hide their shameful failure. to reach the impossible ideal. Here are some of the ways that the hierarchy of the cult was worse. Status within the cult distorted family relations. Annika's mother achieved high status and was close to the leader. She managed one of the cult facilities. She believed that whatever was required to move herself and her family higher in the hierarchy was justified. Observing her mother's status made Annika want to be special and at the center of things too. She now recognizes that her behavior was an attempt to receive her mother's approval by following her mother's lead. As Annika rose in the hierarchy, she felt proud and more important than her mother. Because of her cult-induced superior attitude and her elevated place, she began to look down on her mother and further distance herself. According to David, Annika's son, children in the cult also learned that relationships were hierarchical. They observed nonverbal cues and markers of cult power and authority. Who received more attention or gifts from the leader? Who sat closer to the leader in programs? Who was invited into the leader's private apartment, etc. Children learn to manipulate and compete rather than connect with others. Children learned how to see themselves as higher or lower based on the leader's favor. David was determined never to find himself in a lower position, with accompanying feelings of shame and worthlessness. Attempting to boost his self-esteem, he reminded himself that his grandparents were longtime respected members with elevated positions. As a result of his early indoctrination, David felt he had no close friends because he was constantly jockeying with his peers for an elevated position. When he attended school outside the cult after his family left the residential facility, David sought out passive or insecure friends who he could dominate by appearing confident and sure of himself. This behavior was his attempt to retain a higher position in his relationships without empathy. Annika vowed not to abandon David as her mother has abandoned her. Remembering her own feelings of abandonment, she believed that by being physically present for her son, she was protecting him from experiencing maternal loss. However, according to Whitsett, cult parents are continuously thrown off balance, unintegrated. Their normal stress response became hyperactive, resulting in an inability to regulate their emotions. Additionally, it may be that part of the brain that modulates emotions has been weakened through cultic practices that punish critical thinking. When Annika became a mother, her primary focus was anxiously pleasing her cult leader. This interfered with her ability to focus on David. Because of intense cult-induced anxiety, she was unable to connect emotionally with her son through soothing responses. Due to Annika's cult-induced dissociation and anxious cult dependency on the leader, she emotionally abandoned David instead of providing him with the nonverbal empathic responses when he needed comfort. Therefore, David experienced her as cold. As Annika had done, he dissociated from the overwhelming distress induced in the cult. Annika became anxiously hypervigilant, primarily focusing on the leader's needs and the harsh, strict rules. Sadly, despite Annika's conscious desire to be responsive and present, Annika could not focus primarily on her son and provide the right brain to right brain response of empathy and soothing. Suppose a threat is perceived in one's environment, such as the fear of chronic stress of failing to live up to the highest standards of cult perfection, or fear of bad karma, of being reported and verbally attacked by others. In that case, the sympathetic nervous system prepares for the threat, embodied processes are disrupted. Calm and a feeling of safety are impossible while experiencing this threat. This affects the parent's ability to calm their children. In contrast to child rearing, regulated responsive interactions create a sense of safety and curiosity in the baby. Healthy, secure attachment influences not only outward behavior, but also internal states. That is, the baby can regulate emotional arousal better in the face of trauma and stress. To be a good mother, Annika sought to comfort and guide David according to the cult's thinking. She wanted to give him a strong sense of right and wrong. However, her approach failed to comfort him because this harsh black and white approach lacked nuance, and her dissociative state prevented her from demonstrating empathy with her words. In forming an attachment bond through somatically expressed communication, the mother needs to synchronize and resonate with the infant's arousal levels of negative and positive states, ideally. Implicit nonverbal psychobiological communication processes occur in the earliest interactions between mother and child. Shaw emphasizes the centrality of right brain structures, which are the implicit and conscious and emotion processing modes of communication that dominate human experience. These right brain to right brain processes include facial communications, auditory communications, tactile communications, emotionally charged communications. Trauma can be passed down from generation to generation, affecting unconscious behavior and beliefs like roast. It could even be transmitted to children in utero. Loosening of called control. Monica and her family leave the cult physically and mentally. When David was 4 and Monica was pregnant with her daughter, the family needed to move from the facility, but they remained members. They experienced a new sense of freedom. They were free of the daily schedule and the cult's pervasive harsh moral voice. They were free to decide how to live, spend their lives, when and what they would eat. Annika remembers being relieved not always to be on high alert about where the cult leader was and how she might gain the leader's benevolent attention or have her child gain that attention. Annika has a warm memory of the first time she had the freedom to take her 4-year-old son to the park where they could play. Her description of the pleasure and exciting time playing with David is indicative of the responsive mother that she could have been if she hadn't been in the cult. Annika's dissociative state lessened as she felt less watched. Thus, her daughter experienced growing up with a more empathic parent. However, because of these early child-related experiences and Annika's dissociation, the need to follow strict cult rearing practices David continued to feel disconnected from his mother, experienced her as. Therefore, because of dissociative and anxious traits, many children raised in cults may struggle with accessing their emotions and emotional regulation. They may struggle with dissociation as well as periods of high degree of anxiety and therefore difficulty with emotional regulation. The cult has no room for humility or compassion for human flaws. To avoid experiencing shame, cult members incorporated the attitude they must be hypervigilant and strive for unattainable standards of perfection. And these attitudes usually continue after them. Cult leaders' harsh attitudes were incorporated in personalities. Always to be productive, be right, not wasting time, have fun. As a hatha yoga teacher, Annika initially placed rigid demands on her suburban women students. She was judgmental because they treated classes as exercise rather than for spiritual awakening. They wore makeup and bling. They were not dedicated to learning Sanskrit, etc. Annika left the cult burdened by deep guilt and self-criticism every time she was not industrious, continuing to hear the cult leader's harsh moral voice in her head. She believed that any pleasurable recreation was wasting her life, and she struggled to allow herself to enjoy leisure time. David initially felt shame, struggling with negative emotions. To counter shame, he initially dehumanized others as worthless or as a waste of time in a defensive attempt to feel superior. And this shame. David believes he grew up without experiencing genuine empathy or feeling empathy, which left him in a cold way of responding to others. Away from the cult, as his shame is lessened, his empathy is increased. Annika's husband initially had experienced the original male leader as a new father in the cult, as an opportunity for a new family. However, the cult's leader's sexual were marital relationships. Husband had heard rumors with the sexual involvement, and he began to wonder Annika shared remote sexualization with her therapists to find her experience of sexual abuse. Annika began to see that she had indeed been sexually abused, and she and her husband became angry. They wrote a letter to the current feed leader describing the sexual abuse and severing their relationship with the cult. See the male leader as a pedophile instead of a perfect being required a complete paradigm shift. They got no response from their letters, and the victims also wrote response. They started to feel betrayed. This allowed them to move all the ways and brain experience. Over time with therapy, Annika and her husband distanced themselves from the cult, eventually ending financial support and refraining from visiting the facility. Although they experienced some degree of relief, they also mourned the loss of the system. David experienced kindergarten as having meaner children and had difficulty adjusting. He became more aggressive. Therefore, David became enrolled in a private school, which was nurturing with clear-cut rules, including no media, television, or he found that the community's acceptance of the whole, he found comfort in the community's acceptance of both the worlds. As with many other former cult members, initially his family felt morally superior after the cult standards and in their higher place in the hierarchy. Their cult-induced sense of superiority initially alienated David, her husband, Annika, her husband, and David from their new community, making it harder for them to be friends, also for now, or express toeholds. Look how the leaves have allowed for you. Annika spent the next 20 years say to me, I need to feel like it's absolutely aspectuous. Smaller one with former members from cult, a larger one with former members of various cults. Annika began to see how other former members were experiencing similar struggles. It helped her better to find. Initially, David continued the cult pattern of surrendering to others or attempt to control them. After college, he decided to take ownership of the direction of his life and thus pick and choose what to believe about reading and listening to broadcasts. He was inspired by extreme leadership, by Navy SEAL, the art of war. After the cult leader's deception, David found most comfortable relying on himself to drive his recovery. He discovered Buddhist meditation. He also visited several therapists who failed to recognize the Nelson personality, and eventually found a cult therapist. After childhood impact on dissociation, David continued to be struggled by his inability to access emotions. And he enrolled in John Hopkins' Silas study for post-traumatic stress. Now David consciously attempts to replace cult's harsh attitudes with kindness. David began playing the guitar, and he used it to oppress others. And this is his ability to mentor others and started teaching 7th to 12th grade fluency. Until the cult dynamics effect child rearing was explored, Annika and David remained emotionally distant from one another, and David continued to see his mother as cold. However, David and Annika were with me in a series of moments to develop this. They could reflect on and deconstruct their early communications and experiences together. They examined closely how the cultural dynamics harm their relationship. As a result, through their self-examination, Annika and David began to come alive and feel, express emotions, their sadness, anger, emotionally. Genuine warmth and and then flourish in their relationship. Presently, Annika and David feel emotionally connected and can freely express love for one another. David now recognizes that his mother is dissociative rather than examining cult control impacts cult parents as Annika experiences shame, lesson called moral injury, enhances agency and prevents healing. This approach also assists those like David, raised in a cult, and then a better perspective on their childhood and developing empathy for their peers. might have been more to the so therapy for cult parents and their children. Therapy centers early addressing disruptive cult dynamics, education, and focusing on the harsh conscience and providing a trauma-informed approach to systematic difficulties. It can be helpful as I wasn't working as a therapist. I was just working on the paper with Monica and her son, but meetings with the parents and children, if possible, can be so helpful to both of them if they're willing. And part of therapy should be addressing a more trauma-informed approaches to somatic neurosis. To somatic reactions in sessions for the therapist to pick that up and help people get in touch with some wiring and bringing through for the relationships. So good relationships after the cult. As they collaborated on this paper, I came to understand how the cult Monica and David gained an empathic connection. And I found myself, too, moving from an intellectual to an embodied emotional understanding. In our meetings, I joined on it. Thank you. I'm probably funny like a son for all the work that Ben did. Okay, hi everybody. Well, I'm with Doni Whitsett. She's a clinical emeritus clinical professor at USC, University of Southern California, and been in private practice. And I've been in this field for about 40 years, no longer for million. So Lorna's talk obviously was wonderful, and there's so much we could talk about. What I've done is pull out a little piece of this. Lorna mentioned a little bit of neurobiology and attachment, and I'm going to kind of go a little bit deeper into neurobiology of dissociation. If you may glaze over, if you're not interested in neurobiology, you should leave now. But I am very interested in it. I've been studying it and teaching it, and so I hope you'll find it interesting as well. So Lorna gave another definition of dissociation. On the psychological level, as she said, it's a dissociation between the connections between thoughts, feelings, behaviors, identity, and memories. But from a neurobiological level, there's a disconnection to or non-communication between neural networks involved in somatic experience and awareness, making it impossible to be aware of what's going on in our bodies and our emotions, basically having alexithymia. Okay, so the autonomic nervous system is the key to dissociation. To understand this, well, first of all, to understand this, I have to put on my glasses. Okay, to understand this, we need to talk about the polyvagal theory as described by Stephen Porges. But this is a very simplistic, elevated talk of polyvagal theory. As social beings, we are wired to connect with others for safety and survival.
Our ancestors learned a long time ago that they had a better chance of surviving an attack by a predator if they banded together in groups and weren't alone. So our nervous systems evolved to detect danger even before we are consciously aware of it and to move toward the safety with others. And it's the job of the right amygdala to be the smoke detector. Bessel van der Kolk, if you know him, this is his term. The amygdala is the smoke detector to detect threat. All of our responses to events are actions in the service of connection, protection, and survival. The autonomic nervous system is basically divided into two parts, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And the parasympathetic is further divided into two parts. The oldest part was just called the dorsal vagal, and the newer evolutionary part called the ventral vagus. When we are in the latest pathway, the ventral vagus, and this is Deb Dana, you may be familiar with her. She has depicted the polyvagal theory on a ladder, which I think is very nice, so that when you are feeling connected to the world, you're feeling safe, you're in the ventral vagus and you're in the most evolved part of your brain. But when something can trigger you and trigger you down into the sympathetic part where you are in fight or flight mode, and then if you really get terrorized or terrified, you're in the dorsal vagus, and that is where dissociation occurs. Okay. Dissociation takes many forms, and there are many names for it. Freeze, collapse, faint, fawn, please and appease, and submit, and others. But this is all in the service of survival and feeling safe. So in the case of Annika, her dissociation seems to have taken the form of pleasing and appeasing leaders and submitting to them. But it was all done in the service of protection, safety, and connection, both for herself and her family. And I think that's what's so important to remember, that all of this is in the service of protecting ourselves and our family. And that's what she did. So structurally, there are two types of dissociation structurally. There is the vertical, which is top down, bottom up, and horizontal. In terms of vertical dissociation, top down and bottom up, when we dissociate, there's a disconnection between the higher cortical regions, where we are thinking part of the brain, judgment, reasoning, critical thinking, and the lower cortical regions, the emotional part of the brain, the limbic system, and the reptilian brain. When we're anxious, we are basically flooded with emotion and have a hard time thinking clearly. An optimally functioning brain has strong synaptic connections up and down, so that people can both feel and think at the same time. Otherwise, they may be flooded with emotion, so they're in the limbic system or in the reptilian brain, or intellectualizing, they're only in the higher cortical regions. And they're not tuned in then to what their gut is feeling, or what the gut is telling them. And we now know that the little brain is in the gut too, so we have to connect them. One of the most salient issues that occurs in vertical dissociation, top down, bottom up, is when the right amygdala, which is the lower brain, picks up danger. As in trauma, it puts out cortisol, which shuts down the hippocampus. The hippocampus is like a filing cabinet. I'm going slowly because this is a little more technical. And it sends, the hippocampus is like a filing cabinet. It puts events into time and place folders. In other words, it provides a context for them and sends the information up to the frontal cortex for long-term memory consolidation. But when the hippocampus is flooded with cortisol, it can't do its job. Instead, the events are not dated or placed correctly. Thus, when memories of those events are triggered, those past events are experienced as if they're happening in the present, resulting in flashbacks and intrusive thoughts. Now, in terms of horizontal dissociation, the right and left brains, each hemisphere is lateralized for certain functions, but it isn't that each hemisphere is only responsible for those functions. It's just that like the right brain emphasizes these and the left brain emphasizes these. And you can see the characteristics of them. The right brain, we say, is the unconscious brain, nonverbal. It doesn't have words except if you think about a 2-year-old who goes, no, mine. That's the right brain. Because the left brain really doesn't come online till about age 4. Okay. So these are the characteristics of the right brain: analytical, the gut feelings, it's intuitive. Our right brain is more intuitive. The left brain is literal, logical, linguistic, letter of the law, and it loves that all these words start with L. And what's important then is that the right brain is dependent on the left brain to speak for it. And since trauma resides in the right brain for the most part, verbalizing the right brain's experiences are essential for processing those experiences and integrating them into the psyche. The expression "name it to tame it," has anybody heard that one? Name it to tame it, speaks to this idea that putting words on traumatic experiences breaks down the charge. Then there's the corpus callosum, which is a bundle of fibers which joins the two hemispheres, and it's the highway for this process to occur, for the left brain to put words on right brain experiences. The right brain, the smoke detector, specializes in threat appraisal, so it's important that the right brain develops optimally. How does that happen? Well, Lorna spoke really about how that happens. To answer that question, we need to back up a little bit. We are born with 86 billion neurons, but they're not connected. They are waiting for the environment to tell them which ones should be connected and which ones are not needed to adapt in any particular environment. Those neurons that get stimulated will survive, and if 2 or more are stimulated at the same time, they'll form a neural connection, because neurons that wired together and survive together. And that is attributed to Ronald Hebb, who claims he did not say it, that somebody else said it, but I can't remember who that is. So we attribute it to him anyway. Okay, so let's see. The right brain develops first, and there's a massive growth spurt in the first 18 months of life. What this means then is that the right brain has earlier and stronger connections into the autonomic nervous system than does the left. And since the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, is the key to dissociation, as we saw in the polyvagal theory, the right brain is the key to dissociation. So when we ask the question, how does the right brain develop optimally, we are looking at what happens in those earliest years as the right brain is forming. And this leads us to attachment experiences. The story of the right brain is really the story of attachment, and attachment is the story of the right brain. Because the right brain is online at least 3 years earlier before the left, the earliest memories of attachment experiences are laid down in neural networks in the right brain. From birth, the baby seeks eye contact, facial expressions, and vocal tones. The mother responds, could be father, parent responds with mirroring, smiling, cooing, soft tones, rocking, and holding. The sight of mother's smiling face, joy in seeing the baby, releases in the baby's body a cascade of feel-good chemicals, opiates, dopamine, and serotonin. These nonverbal signals are processed in the right brain of both mother and infant, creating a limbic resonance, a shared emotional state that regulates the baby's nervous system. It regulates the baby's nervous system. Consistent, sensitive responses from the mother build secure attachment, which correlates with healthy right brain development. These early emotional interactions literally sculpt the baby's neural architecture through a proliferation of axons and dendrites, building strong connections up and down higher cortical regions, lower cortical regions, especially in the orbital frontal cortex, which is behind the eyes, which is vital for empathy. I wish I could show you a video. And you might be able to pull it up online. You can see the proliferation of the axons and dendrites just moving. It's really fascinating to watch as they're growing, and that's what connects the neural network. Okay, where am I? This is what we mean then when we say that the maturation of the brain is experience dependent. A new brain is dependent upon an older brain for its architecture. And what's the video I would need? I know, and I tried to find it beforehand. I can't. But I think if you just look up growth of the brain, axons, dendrites, proliferation, I'm sure you could probably find it somewhere. Yeah, sorry. Okay. So, okay. Okay. This, yeah. On the flip side, so I was saying that when the baby sees the smiling face of the mother, it's a cascade of really feel-good chemicals, and the baby feels wonderful. On the flip side, if the baby sees an angry or fearful face, or one that doesn't react at all, cortisol, the stress hormone, is released. And cortisol is very toxic. So instead of the baby's brain being flooded with the feel-good chemicals, it's flooded with toxic ones such as cortisol. And then not only is neural growth inhibited, but old ones can die off. Plus, it doesn't feel good. So if you think about it, what will happen then is when the baby sees an angry face of a mother, or a mother that's so stressed in a cult, okay, that face becomes associated with a very bad, yucky feeling in the body, as opposed to, oh, mom is so happy to see me, and I feel really good because I'm being flooded with opiates, that's the difference. And that is what forms the secure attachment, really. The seeing and the feeling forms a secure attachment or an insecure attachment. Okay. So this type of interaction, the last one I was talking about, may result in insecure attachment, often in a D type of attachment, the disorganized, disoriented, and dissociated. Disorganized because the baby needs the mother to make sense of their somatic experiences. Disoriented because they're confused. They expect a smiling face and instead they get an angry face or something like that. And dissociated because they then just get disengaged and shut down. These early interactions then are laid down in the implicit memory circuits in the right brain, particularly the right amygdala, which is again our earliest threat assessor. And we know from research that children with this D type of attachment are more likely to dissociate in adulthood because it was their default coping mechanism in childhood. Okay, if they're stressed in adulthood. And by the way, that actually makes them more more vulnerable to PTSD, because we know that people who dissociate during a trauma are more likely to get PTSD. And that's Rachel Yehuda's work. I'm not going to go over this, but here is some neurotransmitter support. You can look at those. I think this is being recorded. And these are some of the structures that are involved in dissociation. And here are some of my selected references. Thank you.